All right, so picking it back up here, part two, the super confusing part of Walker, part 180. So I'm going to kind of use, I get paid to do this, right? So I know a little bit about Aristotle and I kind of can understand some of this stuff beyond just the reading itself. So I'm going to help out a little bit with some background here. So, but this, I'm looking at page 180 for this part two. So, one thing that I happen to know about Aristotle is that Aristotle talks about politics and the goal of politics being to create a good society. And it's actually in the Aristotle reading. But he goes way into that in his larger text. And so the idea is that, it's hard to have a good, successful life if you live in a world that doesn't function very well, or at least your world, your local world. So if we want a good world, then we want it to be the case that not just we flourish, but that in general, those in our world flourish. So in general, Aristotle talks about sort of wanting to bring about flourishing of the society, not just our own flourishing. He even talks about, true friends want to make each other better. So we don't just pursue our own flourishing, right? Is the basic idea is that there's this general desire to want the flourishing of others. So this is how Walker's going to get from our own flourishing to the flourishing of non-human animals. So now I'm going to kind of almost read this one flat out. So remember, there's several things that go into flourishing, right? It's what makes us human is the ability to exercise reason. But there's things that we want to be able to do that help contribute to us to flourishing as humans besides just using reason. So, having good use of our physical capacities, for instance, right? So Walker's going to say that generally for us to have awesome lives, we would want two main things at minimum, right? We want to be able to develop and exercise our various capacities. So that might include being virtuous, but also we want to be able to exercise, move about, engage socially, things like that, right? So a good society is one that allows that to be possible for us because it allows us to lead truly human lives. So now you can see where she's going, right? So just as we want to lead truly human lives, we want to create a society or a world in which animals are allowed to live their best versions of their lives. So we also need sufficient external goods, right? So we should, we want housing, we want shelter, we want food, etc. So there's no difference in that regard between the way that we think about it and the way that we might think of what non-human animals need to flourish. Non-human animals can be understood to be unable to flourish if they are unable to exercise their capacities or if they're deprived of sufficient external goods. So if we generally care about living in a world where flourishing is something possible for all, not just ourselves, we would want animals to be able to flourish in these ways too. So the argument goes. So I think if you just bring it back and make it clear in your mind with an example, it helps, right? So imagine an animal that has large natural habitat and diversity of food, that we would think of that as an environment in which it can be very much the animal that it was quote unquote meant to be. But imagine that we provided the same animal a perfectly pain-free, even pleasant existence by giving it a bunch of sort of manufactured food and you put it on a treadmill, etc., right? So it's free of pain, it has a pleasant experience, but it doesn't seem like it's thriving simply because it's not able to be the sort of creature it is supposed to be. That's the basic idea here. And I mentioned this in class. So this is why I think talking the language of virtue can be helpful, right? If we talk in the language of suffering, it sort of doesn't do a great job capturing the wrongness of being being deprived the ability to cultivate one's capacities. So that's why it's sort of interesting to think about the difference between freedom from suffering or even having a lot of pleasure and true flourishing, right? I gave this example when we were walking out of lab on Monday. For those of you who are there, imagine you could be hooked up on a machine that kept you fed, provided a steady stream of drugs that had no side effects, so you felt good all the time, right? So you might say, well, that's pretty awesome, pretty good deal. But we could sort of ask, well, do we really think that's a human existence? And that's all Walker's ultimately getting at, right? Is that we're bothered by a polar bear in captivity because it's being deprived of the ability to fully realize its potential as a polar bear. So when we think of animals, I don't have another slide, but I just want to talk you guys through this. When we think of animals, what's interesting about the different languages is that they can get at different aspects. So Singer is really good by taking this utilitarian approach to get us to thinking about, we're causing a ton of unnecessary pain, which he says is speciesist, because we're prioritizing a pretty small amount of pleasure for ourselves at this extraordinary expense for animals. So utilitarianism does a really good job at why doing, superficial research on animals is wrong, or, why eating meat is wrong, or factory farming is wrong, or et cetera, right? Someone who comes from a Kantian perspective isn't going to do a great job thinking about most animals, but could do some really interesting work thinking about animals that have rational capacity, because you could argue that a primate or a dolphin actually should be entitled to all the rights that human beings have, right? It would be 100% immoral to keep a dolphin in captivity, to keep a primate in captivity. A primate should be as immune from having research done to it involuntarily as a human being. So you get very privileged status for certain animals for a Kantian approach. And then, what Singer is less good at is, what's wrong with a polar bear with a pretty pleasant experience, right? And certainly Kant can't get at that either. So I think that's what's kind of neat about the Walker approach here, is you can sort of begin to think about different issues rather than just sort of overt causing of pain. So when you think of the case study about what should happen when you're done with a research animal, and you think of sanctuaries, you can begin to think like, well, the one argument for a sanctuary is like that is the place where it is most likely that an animal can most be what it is, right? And you notice that to some extent utilitarianism and virtue ethics are in this delicate balance there, because in a sanctuary that's unregulated, they may or may not actually be able to live their most polar bear-like existence, for example. Or, they might get mistreated, so there's a risk element in terms of their treatment. But in the ideal, they're going to have a much better, more fulfilling life. And so it complicates the discussion a little bit when we get at it that way. So anyways, I hope this is useful as a way to think about the Walker and a little more on Aristotle. I think a lot of these readings, they can be tough. What I hope for you guys, though, is that what they do is I think that a really difficult reading, it's easy to just give up. But if you really go slow and you say, okay, it's going to take me, I'm going to spend 3 hours on a 20-page reading. If you ever watch me go through a reading, I always think of it as sort of a delicate balance between the parts and the whole. So I'm struggling to understand any given sentence and then a paragraph. And then I try to put that paragraph into my own words. And then I get that paragraph in my own words. And then I try to get the next idea, the main idea of the next paragraph. And I begin to sort of just try to understand each piece. And then I start thinking about how these pieces connect to each other. as part of one overall narrative and how they all fit into the thesis. If you could do that, it's an amazingly difficult skill, right? So it's one reason I have you guys do this, is just to develop that ability to really become excellent analytic thinkers. And if you're able to ever just like take a difficult reading and explain it in your own words, you got it. All right. Talk to you Monday.